Aloha and welcome to our talk, A Match Made in Heaven. My name is Patrick Wardle. I am the Principal Security Researcher here at Jamf, and today I am stoked to be co-presenting with my colleague Jaron Bradley, who is the Detections Team Lead. Alright, so what are we going to talk about today? First, we'll discuss a brief overview of the current threat landscape on macOS. This will give us a good understanding of the threats facing both macOS users and the enterprise. Then we'll discuss how to detect these threats, focusing on two main detection concepts: signatures and behaviors. Finally, we'll show why a combination of both is really the best match, the best combination that can provide generic detections against both current and future threats. So let's start by briefly discussing the current macOS threat landscape. As noted, this will give us a good understanding of the threats facing both Mac users and the enterprise, and highlight what we're up against as defenders of macOS. First, an observation. As Macs become more prevalent, more popular, especially in the enterprise, unfortunately, so do attacks and malware targeting macOS. I mean, this is fairly obvious. Hackers are incredibly opportunistic. So as Apple's global computer market share grows, and as I mentioned, Macs push more into the enterprise, hackers have taken note. Recently, we've seen attackers targeting macOS, albeit with methods that were traditionally only focused on Windows-based computers. For example, document-based attacks that leverage Office documents laden with malicious macros. This attack vector, long common in the Windows arena, we're now seeing these opportunistic attackers who are focusing on macOS more than ever, bringing their Windows-based attacks to the Mac platform. Here's a specific example of one of these document-based attacks attributed to the Lazarus APT group. It's a good example because it also shows sophisticated hacker groups are also leveraging this technique as well. So once the malicious Word document was opened, unfortunately the malicious macros would be executed, which, as we can see on the slide, would trigger the Mac-specific logic, which would download and execute a persistent macOS backdoor. Now, we shouldn't give the attackers too much credit because the reality is these document-based attacks are rather lame. There's alerts warning the user that the documents contain malicious macros, and moreover, the malicious code will be constricted or constrained by the macOS application sandbox. However, we worry, could these attacks be far worse? And unfortunately, the answer is yes. So we spent a few days finding 0 days in Microsoft Office in the application sandbox to craft a full exploit chain capable of infecting a fully patched macOS system by simply opening a malicious Office document. Best part, well, from an offensive point of view, no alerts, no prompts. Open it, you're toast. Yikes. Now, Apple has done a great job, especially in macOS Catalina, improving the overall security, the baseline security of macOS, which has forced attackers to evolve and improve their tactics. It's always a cat and mouse game, always will be, but the bar is raised by Apple. The attacks are essentially forced to become more sophisticated. So we've seen this as well. Recent examples that illustrate this increase in the sophistication of attacks include the use of zero-day vulnerabilities, highly targeted attacks, and also improved stealth techniques. A very recent example of this, something that we actually saw just about a month ago, was something that was able to bypass Apple's notarization process. So on recent versions of macOS, the operating system will only run software that has been explicitly approved by Apple via their notarization service. Unfortunately, wily attackers, sophisticated malware authors, found a way to coerce or trick Apple into notarizing their known malware. This is problematic because it means they were then able to leverage this in an adware campaign, and the malware, which had now been notarized, essentially approved by Apple, would be able to execute. even on Apple's latest and greatest operating system, Big Sur. So unfortunately, attacks and infection vectors are gaining more sophistication. And so too is the macOS malware that's being deployed via these attacks. So let's briefly look at EvilQuest, which is a new malware sample from 2020, which has some rather nefarious capabilities, including the ransoming of users' files. Now, arguably the most interesting facet about EvilQuest is its ability to virally infect the system. Yes, it may be the first computer virus, true virus, targeting macOS. That is to say, once it gains access to a system, it virally modifies and infects other binaries on the system. So even if you remove the original malware, the system is still infected. We also noted it has the propensity to encrypt or ransom users' files. And besides this, it has a series of remote commands that allow an attacker full and persistent access to an infected system. It's really a very complex, fully featured Mac malware system. So that's a brief overview of the current threat landscape on macOS, right? Zero-day exploits, Windows-based attacks, and now we're targeting macOS, advanced, sophisticated malware. A lot of challenges here. Now I'm going to hand the talk over to Jaron, who is going to talk about various detection-based concepts.
Thank you, Patrick. Hello, everybody. I'm Jaron, and I'm here to talk to you about detection concepts on macOS, specifically the ones we use here at Jamf to protect users from known and unknown malware. So first, we're going to jump into signatures, and what signatures do we block? Now, before we get super deep into this, just know that signatures are commonly used as a way to detect malware that the world already knows about. In other words, this is malware that's been detected on somebody's system out there in the wild, and now we want to take that malware and we want to make sure that it doesn't run on any other systems. We want to deny it access everywhere else. So we use a couple different identifiers to do this. One is the file hash. Another is by focusing on signature or signing information, specifically that of the team ID. And then finally, Yara signatures. So we'll dive into each of these. But before we do, I'm just going to touch on hash really quickly because a lot of people are already familiar with what a hash is. But if you're not, just know that a hash is basically a fingerprint for a file. In other words, if I see a file on one system that has a hash that matches exactly that of a file on another system, then I know that those files are exactly the same. The way this works is if you have a hash that has been identified as malicious, you know that you no longer want that hash to be allowed to run. So this is a really easy win for us just by taking known hashes that are out there in the wild that have been identified as malicious, and we keep a known database of those, and we don't allow them to run when they turn up on systems. All right, so getting in a little deeper, we have the team ID. Now the team ID is a field inside of the signature information of an application or executable. Now, for those of you that aren't really familiar with the developer process, just know that when you build an app and you're ready to release it to the world, you want to make sure that application is signed with your developer certificate. This is going to allow you, when a user tries to open your app, it's going to allow you to get by Gatekeeper. Gatekeeper is going to do the right checks to make sure it's signed legitimately, and it's only getting harder on macOS to run applications or executables that are not signed. So developers are definitely making sure their applications are signed now. Likewise, malware authors, a lot of malware authors are doing the same thing because it's very difficult to get their applications to run if macOS is throwing a bunch of prompts and blocking it. So the team ID is associated with the developer or the team that designed that application. So if we found an application that has been signed by a malicious developer, we will now block that team ID. And now any application that's designed now into the future, into the past, whatever, anytime someone tries to run an application that's signed by the same developer, it will also be blocked. As an extension to Apple's great signing and notarization features, where they often revoke certificates associated with malware, We take a relatively aggressive stance based on the reputation of developers, particularly as it relates to adware and grayware. For example, if a developer certificate has signed an application or packaged with a known bad item on our list, by default, we won't trust other software items signed by that developer. We feel that packaging with adware at install time should question a developer's reputation. This was more common in prior years, but still relevant today, where developers would release free software and rely on the installation of adware or spyware to gain financial benefit. Sometimes this was also done by inexperienced developers who might not have really known that they were agreeing to work with adware designers. When this occurs, the adware terms generally get stuffed into the EULA agreement, and that user would accept at install time. If we identify that this has happened, we assume the developer's reputation damaged, and we will now block their team ID. Many applications that practice the bundling of adware into their releases tend to be applications that actually accomplish very little on your system. For example, an application that says, clean your Mac, when in reality all it really does is remove a few cookies and a couple cache locations while installing adware in the background. These applications are simple for shady developers to build quickly and then gain monetization via adware. Now, no signature talk would be complete without at least mentioning Yara. Yara has become known as the Swiss Army knife of signatures in the security community. It operates with this older antivirus approach where you identify unique strings or byte patterns inside of malicious files and then look for those patterns inside of other files to determine if there's any matches. One of the major benefits of Yara is that it's free and open source, which made it a prime candidate for us to integrate into Jamf Protect. So what you're looking at here on this slide is one potential Yara rule for the malware Windtail. Here we've looked inside Windtail and found strings that we think are specific to this particular sample and defined them as $1 through $4. We've then specified in our condition of this rule that in order to classify a file as Windtail, we expect that 2 of these strings are going to be seen inside that file, and that file is less than 300 kilobytes, likely because this sample that we've analyzed of Windtail was less than 300 kilobytes. In our condition, we've decided that we only expect to see 2 of these strings because they seem to be pretty unique, and because if the author of this malware now goes back and modifies his malware, hopefully 2 of these strings out of the 4 of them will remain unchanged. So this is just a way of hoping that maybe we'll detect on any future samples of Windtail that pop up in the future with this very basic rule. So this is just scraping the surface of Yara. Rules can get a lot more advanced, but right now we just wanted to give you an idea of how it works. Now, another one of the major benefits of Yara is that, say we have 1,000 malware samples of a specific family. Rather than looking for 1,000 hashes, we might be able to write a simple Yara rule that can pick up all of these hashes. So it also becomes a fantastic way to save on resources.
Now I'm going to talk about how we can use behaviors to detect malicious threats. Now, signatures, as Jaron talked about, are a great way to detect known or existing threats. The problem is they're generally not sufficient against next generation or completely novel threats. The reality is, though, even these new threats perform actions or activities that are, by definition, anomalous. So the idea is simply to observe the system and detect these anomalous events to determine when the system has been infected, even if it's something we have never seen before. So on the slide, I've listed several of these events or activities we monitor for in order to detect malicious behavior. First, it's imperative that you're monitoring the system for process level events, something you can do with a process monitor. For example, returning to the attacks, the office-based exploits and macros we talked about earlier, turns out we can actually generically detect these by observing what I term suspicious child processes. That is to say, should an Office document ever be spawning a child process, for example, curl or Python? We don't think so. It's also wise to monitor for persistence events. Persistence being the way malware installs itself to ensure that it's automatically re-executed every time the system restarts. So, What we can do is simply observe or monitor for persistence events, examine what is being persisted, and if it's not something that we recognize, something legitimate, we can alert or block on this fact, purely based on this simple behavior. We can also monitor for other events that cumulatively can indicate something is amiss. For example, the malware known as Windtail, we can detect its exploitation vector by observing the fact that Safari downloads and auto-extracts an application. That same application triggers the registration of a custom URL scheme, and then that application that just registered itself is launched from a website. Cumulatively, these behaviors are indicative of an exploitation attempt that now we can detect and alert on. Again, with no a priori knowledge of this perhaps specific malware.
So now we'll take a look at how we've applied signatures and behaviors in the real world. But first, let's do a little bit of review. The two different types of detections that we've discussed both have strengths and weaknesses. So signature-based detections, although a little more old school, allow us to easily detect and even prevent known malware at a very low false positive ratio. This is because we use indicators that have already been identified as malicious in the past. However, a major issue with signature-based detections is that attackers can generally modify their malware pretty easily in order to evade them. To change a hash, all you have to do is modify a single byte in the file. To change a team ID requires simply buying a new signing certificate. And to evade Yara rules can sometimes be done by strongly modifying the malware contents. The other fundamental flaw, long known to antivirus vendors, is that signature-based detections rely on at least one unfortunate user out there to get infected before the necessary information can be blocked. Behavioral-based detections, on the other hand, can often detect a good portion of known threats, and are also a fantastic way to detect novel threats that are yet to be identified in the wild. However, they often involve additional investigation to determine if they triggered true malware, or if some legitimate software on the system happened to behave oddly, resulting in a false positive. Let's jump into some applied examples. The first detect that you're looking at here in the Jamf Protect UI is that of a Yara signature match for EvilQuest malware. As Patrick mentioned earlier, EvilQuest came out in late June of 2020, and inside of the malware was actually a key. This key was used to encrypt traffic from the infected system up to the server. And as it turns out, by looking for this key in other files is actually a fantastic way to detect thousands of samples of EvilQuest. So this is great that we can take the key inside of EvilQuest and use it to scan files and actually cover thousands of samples of EvilQuest. However, this does not solve the initial problem that somebody out there had to be infected by EvilQuest before we knew it existed and knew that this key could be used as a signature. This is where behavioral-based detections come into play. At Jamf Protect, we were actually protecting against EvilQuest before anyone even knew it existed. This is because EvilQuest actually triggers one of our behavior detections. What it does is it creates a persistence item, or a launch agent, called com.apple.questd.plist. Now, one of our detections looks for any time a launch agent is created that uses the prefix com.apple. Malware often tries to do this to blend in. If it uses that prefix, we then check to see the process that it's trying to create at startup. If that process or that binary is not signed by Apple, then we're going to send an alert to the Jamf Protect UI. Let's move on to another example that's probably most commonly attributed to that of the Schleyer malware. Schleyer is likely the most prevalent installed malware on macOS. It often gets users to install it by posing as a Flash player update. This is incredibly popular among pirated movie websites, where in order to stream a free movie, you are asked by a pop-up to install a Flash player update. This of course leads to the downloading of a DMG file, which then walks you through the steps of infecting your system. The Schleyer malware itself tends to be unsigned and is often in the form of a short script that frequently gets updated. This makes it very difficult to catch with traditional signatures. One way to detect its installation technique is by monitoring file download events for files that contain specific keywords such as Flash Player. Then, once again, we can rely on signature information to tell us whether or not the downloaded file was signed by Adobe. If it wasn't, Jamf Protect will send an alert to the UI and inform you that a downloaded file is trying to imitate Adobe. So here's an example of this detection showing up in the Jamf Protect UI. I actually specifically chose this example because I get a good kick out of the fact that this fake flashplayer.dmg was downloaded from a website called mackymcmacface.com. This just shows you how popular Schlayer is. People are going to install it no matter where it's coming from. It doesn't matter the domain. As you can see down in the signing info, this flashplayer.dmg is not actually signed by anybody, which is why the detection fires here. The next example we'll explore is that of the SIGIN malware. This malware is once again script-based and would decode a large base64 string in order to write contents to a launch agent. There's actually quite a few behavioral-based detections we could create here. But a good behavior-based detection is one that will trigger on a technique used by multiple different malware authors with a low false positive ratio. Highlighted in red, you see a perfect example of such a behavior. The SIGIN malware actually creates a hidden launch agent. This is something that no legitimate application should ever really do, and yet it's been done by multiple different malware families in the past. Therefore, we've set up a detection in Jamf Protect that looks for any time a launch agent is created where the plist is hidden. There's actually a second hidden file detection immediately below this line. We see that the executable this plist is trying to run at startup is also hidden. This makes another great indicator that we're dealing with something very suspicious. Here you see what this detection looks like when it appears in the Jamf Protect UI. Not only do we see that a hidden plist was created, but we also see that it was created by a very strange looking echo command that was piped to base64. All these signs point to malware. Now there's an additional benefit to behavioral based detections that we haven't addressed yet, and that's the fact that they're also able to detect more than just malware. They're also able to detect when some vulnerabilities are at play on the operating system. For example, earlier this year, we blogged about how an old Zoom application used a faulty update process. This update process used the authorization execute with privileges API that has long been deprecated by Apple. This is because a process with elevated privileges called security auth trampoline is used to install an update as root. Long story short, if the update isn't handled carefully, it can easily lead to privilege escalation vulnerabilities. This means if an attacker is already on the system, they may be able to easily gain root access by specifying their own executable to run as root during the update process. Jamf Protect is able to report when something like this in a malicious scenario occurs, as well as report on any software that's performing this vulnerable type of update. This shows us that behavioral detections can offer us more than just malware. They can also provide us with detections of general vulnerabilities.
All right, so let's wrap this up. We started the talk by noting that Macs are becoming ever more prevalent, especially in the enterprise. Now, as we pointed out, we're not the only ones observing these trends. Hackers and malware writers have taken note as well, which has resulted in two main things. First, we've seen Windows-based attacks being ported over to the Mac platform. For example, malicious Office-based attacks. We've also seen the sophistication of these attacks increase, both in terms of exploits and the payloads. For example, the malware that is now being used to infect these Mac systems. So what can we do? Well, we talked about two main approaches: signature-based detections and behaviors. Signatures are great as they can detect all known threats without any false positives. That's a win. Behaviors, on the other hand, are extremely powerful at detecting novel or brand new attacks, both perhaps exploits and malware, based on the fact that they can pick up on anomalous behaviors. That's also a win. So what is the win-win? Well, obviously, it's the combination of both. And that's why here at Jamf, in Jamf Protect, we have created a system that combines both strengths of signature-based detections along with behavior-based detections in a single platform that we believe can comprehensively protect the Mac from both current and future threats. Well, again, thank you for attending our talk. Stay safe and hope to see you all in 2021. Aloha.